Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we got a new solo album review of the newest project from Ed Sheeran, Subtract. I should have realized earlier that I listen to Ed Sheeran differently than the vast majority of people. See, for me, he's a mainstream pop artist that I'll probably cover a couple times a year at most whenever he drops an album or a single of his shows up on Billboard Breakdown and has a radio run. I don't have the omnipresent radio or streaming overexposure that has left so many folks utterly sick of him for being so basic and taking up valuable airtime and exposure away from their personal favorites. Hasn't he done enough damage as it is? We've had to deal with Ed Sheeran for over a decade now. Why exactly is he still here? Hell, it's got to the point where a lot of pop music Twitter news / bait accounts during the most recent Ed Sheeran lawsuit, where he was sued by the estate of a co-writer of Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On over chord progressions, and that could have had a deeply chilling impact on music copyright in a similar way the Blurred Lines lawsuit did, where Ed Sheeran was actually threatening to quit music if he lost. And most of the responses to that news were, good. He should. And that got me really angry at the sheer unbridled ignorance of dumbass fans unwilling to engage with what the repercussions of that case could have been should it have been decided against Ed Sheeran going forward for all their favorites. But then I went something different. I cooled off, and I went outside. Over the weekend, I went to a couple wineries with a few of my friends. In our car, we actually played some Ed Sheeran because a few of them are actually fans. They're just not online. They're talking about seeing him live on the next tour, the struggle it was to get tickets. Now, the response to all that might be, Ed Sheeran makes basic music for basic people. That's probably just your friends being basic, but I don't know about that. I'd rather take the lived-in experience of the reality of Ed Sheeran being a silent majority act who still sells millions of records, whose fans are not ubiquitously online or annoying on social media, especially as the subject of his music has trended a little bit older, especially on Equals, compared to all the folks who like being loud and wrong on Twitter. That being said, the conversation around this new album Subtract, well, it was very muted, even amongst my friends, and that was very revealing to me. For a while now, Ed Sheeran has been alienated from his major label situation, where it sounds like he would rather be doing anything else than a lot of stadium tours or lawsuits that take him away from his wife or his kids, or the funerals of his relatives. Someone argued this goes as far back as Divide, where Ed Sheeran's always been very good at making the pop concession for the huge singles that'll get the radio push so he can then focus on whatever the hell he wants to make. It's one of the reasons that his lead-off singles tend to be pretty rough at best, or at the very least not quite representative of how weird or unique of an artist that Ed Sheeran is. So really, if all you know him for are the overplayed singles, I get why you might be annoyed. But it does seem like with Subtract, Ed Sheeran hit a boiling point. All the promotional material feels very by the numbers to satisfy a lot of contract obligations with Atlantic and Asylum. The rest of the record was reportedly produced by Aaron Dessner of The National, except for the lead-off single, which is where you see Max Martin and Shellback. But that lead-off single, Eyes Closed, was reportedly a leftover song from around 2018, reworked for this album, thus not really representative of the project at all in its sound, and given the lukewarm run that it's received thus far, it creates the impression that this album is the label saying, okay, fine, we satisfied our obligations. We're not giving you any sort of special push. Sink or swim on what you have. Now, I personally think that's rather stupid. Just because labels and focus groups want algorithmically predicted behavior, human reception to art, especially through repeated exposure, they might actually allow some of Ed Sheeran's indie pop and folk sides to work for an audience. He is still a good songwriter, and he's an A-list artist with real commercial draw. And if this is him making his version of folklore, why not give it more attention, especially given how well that album got received? In short, I did really want to like this, especially as someone who really liked Equals and would argue that it was Ed Sheeran's best since Multiply. So how did this go? Well, here's a funny thing. I think the parallel between Subtract and Folklore is a bit more pronounced than you might realize. Both are more subtle and low-key, relying on a lot of winding, windswept texture to pull you into the messier emotional scenes. Both are at least somewhat produced by Aaron Dessner. Both are uncommercial on the surface, but could easily be shipped to pop radio if folks knew what the hell they were doing. And in both cases, despite the likelihood of this project getting a bit more critical acclaim, I actually like the preceding album a little bit more overall, while still thinking this is really good. It has some great standout moments. Granted, I think I'm the exception to every rule in liking both Equals and Lover as much as I do, but there was a pop immediacy to both records that isn't quite here in the same way. But where for Taylor Swift going indie folk was absolutely a swerve, this feels more like Ed Sheeran returning to more of his roots, for the most part for the better, but not always, gotta say. Now, I will freely admit that there are some frustrations that I have with Subtract that are pretty much just unique to me. Ed Sheeran teases us with a couple rock moments on nearly every single album that leaves me wanting the project that'll actually kick more ass. Here, I'd probably say it comes up most on Curtains, which is one of the best songs here. And despite Aaron Dessner producing, this is still very much an Ed Sheeran indie folk singer-songwriter project. Not Ed Sheeran making music in the style of The National with some indie rock muscle. It's thinner, it's more brittle and spare. It also leans more on his falsetto, which I will say has gotten a little bit better, but still is not my preferred range on songs like Borderline and Spark, especially for the singer-songwriter cuts that could use a deeper, earthier vocal presence that might fit with the subject matter a little bit more effectively, add some of that deeper heaviness. And for lack of better words, despite going in a less commercial direction, I wouldn't really call this album that boundary pushing. This is very well tread ground in indie folk with a little bit more polish, if you know you know, and I found myself wishing that Ed Sheeran actually embraced more of those Bon Iver-esque auto-tuned harmonies that I like so much on Afterglow, or he leaned more into the Celtic influences on the excellent closer, The Hills of Aberfeldy. His voice fits that tone really well. It's rare that he uses it. I kind of wish he could. Then there's the pacing. Equals had a diversity of tone and was actually pretty well paced for a pop record, whereas this is necessarily slower, and by the final third absolutely begins to drag with less stylistic variation. If you were only paying attention to the sound and not the lyrics, this would feel like a pivot, but a familiar and honestly rather safe one. But that's not saying you can't do a lot with this sound being so soft focused and intimate. Even if there are points where I feel like Ed Sheeran doesn't play the tracks as intimately as he could, it might fit them better. Boat is the definition of a low-key opener, but it does open up really well into the glittery spare percussion and incredibly brittle acoustics on Saltwater, trying to get you to feel the chill of every moment of that song. And on contrast, I like how warm and burnished the communal scene of Life Goes On is, with some really nice strings interplay in the melody, similar to how the synths interweave with the pianos on End of Youth. But again, I gotta be honest, when this album did showcase some moments with a little bit more punch and muscle, like the bridge of Dusty, where those softer drum machines actually build some rumbling live presence on the bridge, or again, with Curtains probably having the most developed percussion on this entire album, and the sharpest hook around the electric guitar, I just simply wish there was a little bit more of those moments to really showcase more diversity on the album. And while we're here, it's also why I can say that Eyes Closed is the weakest track here, but I absolutely get why it is here. Yeah, the percussion and structure feels kind of dated. It doesn't really have the subtlety of Aaron Dessner's other productions. Max Martin and Shellback try, but it doesn't really get there. But thematically, it makes sense. And this is where I really have to give Ed Sheeran some tangible credit, because by the time we get to the lyrics and themes, this is probably Ed Sheeran's strongest in years. Calling this album Subtract is actually kind of inspired, because it is a deliberate paring down of scope and focus, going more towards his angst and grief at the loss of friends and family, and a genuine fear in how it will shape his life and his relationships going forward. This album starts off very windswept and cold and bleak, and before you all say, well, for Ed Sheeran, it's been an often underrated factor of his writing just how tangibly real and dark it could feel. Look back at a song like Bloodstream, as now Ed Sheeran's on the verge of plunging into those depths. And thus the rest of the album shows the process of dealing with a lot of those very heavy emotions, complicated by the death of a close friend and a real complication with his wife's second pregnancy, where they found a tumor. I mean, I'm sorry, that's the sort of heavy adult level concerns that don't exactly fit well into a pop song, and you can tell he's struggling to cope with and process this with the reality that a lot of the structures that can work for some, they don't always work for him. Life Goes On reflects on a friend who comes from the Caribbean, and he describes the odd feeling of participating in the 9 days of grieving before well, for a lot of other folks, life goes on. And he kind of wanted more. He's not sure he was ready. End of Youth has that same sort of shock to the system that comes with feeling more adult at the loss of loved ones. And while Curtain showcases that desire to help pull himself and others into a brighter future, it's often just not that simple. Emotions in this vein rarely are. Like Sufjan Stevens on Carrie and Lowell, Ed Sheeran gets that the messy adult reality of grief can't be time-boxed or easily quantified, made all the harder because he's got responsibilities to his wife and his family as well, as he knows that loving relationships grow and change as you do. And while, yeah, there's a happy ending on this project, he also knows it was kind of borderline getting there. He's more optimistic, but it's been tempered with reality. Granted, especially in the final couple songs, I do wish there was a little bit more detail in order to flesh out these scenes, especially the relationship scenes. Probably would help them stand out a bit more, because as it is, you have to be invested in a more adult arc for Ed Sheeran to really get the most out of these songs. And even as much as I am, they fell a little shy. But I just know for a fact that even with a shift in sound, for a lot of folks, that emotional investment won't happen. Too many bridges have been burned. They'll drag out a lot of flimsy excuses as to why. It goes back to what I said in my Machine Gun Kelly review of Mainstream Sellout. It's very telling to whom an audience deems worthy of their sympathy or empathy. And to a lot of folks, Ed Sheeran hasn't been in that category for years now. Now, I personally think it's a damn shame, because this is a really damn good album that if it gets attention, it's going to be begrudging, and with a lot of adjectives like cloying and sappy and dull and basic attached to it. Where if you swapped out Ed Sheeran for plenty of other pop stars on name alone, they would call this some of their best work. You know I'm telling the truth there. But I don't know, I think there's a maturity. I think there's an emotive presence to this project that feels poignant. It's not especially marketable when you're at odds with your label, but if this is what is needed for Ed Sheeran to close out a couple doors, venture off into his own space, I'm kind of okay with that too. As it is, I definitely think the project plays to an older audience and to a lot of younger pop fans. It might not click as strongly, even though I think it will probably age pretty well. So my recommendation is a bit more tentative, but go in looking to extend some empathy. You'll get a pretty damn heartwarming album. I mean, I think it works. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I understand that I'm probably going to be way nicer to Ed Sheeran than the vast majority of critics, but screw it. I thought this album was really goddamn good, and I think it deserves a lot of attention. It's going to get a lot of attention as being his version of folklore, and not for some of its own attributes that I think are kind of special, but we'll see how that goes. Just, again, please give it a shot. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved and help and support the channel, get albums on my schedule for me to talk about them at length, or hell, just like support the channel beyond buying my merch or arguing with me on my Discord, link to my Patreon's right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand. The option's available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.